que otras fotos. En República Dominicana sí existen leyes que sancionan la publicación de contenidos peligrosos y violentos. Sin embargo, esta legislación falta difundirla lo suficiente para que los comunicadores, los niños, los jóvenes, las personas en sentido general hagan un buen uso de las redes. A manera de recomendación, recomendamos, ¿no?, desarrollar programas en los centros educativos y familias donde los chicos puedan acceder a este tipo de información. Y por último, preparar a los jóvenes para que puedan hacer análisis de contenido, que no compartan una información sin antes verificar la fuente y la veracidad. Además, el tema del respeto de la persona y del espacio personal del otro. No estamos hablando aquí de prohibir el uso, sino de usarla de la manera correcta para el beneficio personal y profesional de todos y todas. Muchas gracias. Sara.
Bien. Quisiera recalcar, porque ya lo hemos dicho, que estos datos se recogieron, esas entrevistas se hicieron en el 2019, lo que pudiera haber algún cambio después de la pandemia. Recordemos que durante la pandemia todos estos recursos se utilizaron en el proceso educativo. Estamos hablando de jóvenes de 18 a 24 años, universitario la mayoría, y aquí se usó de todo para tratar de salvar la educación en esos 2 años. Por ejemplo, muchos profesores compartían con sus estudiantes contenido y materiales a través de WhatsApp, y era como el medio más utilizado para el asunto de las clases. Entonces, es probable que algunos de estos datos, si lo tomamos ahora, hayan cambiado. Y en segundo lugar, nosotros como país estamos librando una batalla fuerte con relación a compartir noticias falsas y noticias violentas. Observen que los mismos jóvenes dicen que lo hacen y muchas veces ni siquiera se preocupan por saber si eso es verdad o si conocen a esa persona, sino que lo hacen. Sin embargo, algo positivo es que mucho maltrato infantil, violencia intrafamiliar ha salido a la luz a través de las redes, porque todo el mundo anda con una cámara en sus manos, y eso ha ayudado entonces en muchísimos casos a detener, a conocer una serie de casos de violencia que, de no ser por las redes y porque lo compartan, quizá no hubiese sido posible. ¿Por qué? Porque aunque tenemos regulación, aunque tenemos leyes que sancionan todo esto, no hay la posibilidad de un seguimiento estrecho y estar enterado de todo lo que ocurre a nivel privado, entre comillas, con relación a la violencia y específicamente al maltrato infantil, que es otro de los temas fuertes que tenemos institucionalizados algunos. Entonces, las redes han venido también a ayudar y ese compartir, hacer las cosas viral, aunque sean negativas, para contribuir a disminuir a que estas personas puedan ser detenidas y tomar algunas medidas. Nosotras estamos a la disposición por si hay alguna pregunta con relación a este trabajo.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Very informative. And I like the fact that you raised the point about having the ability to post things online with your phone. You know, we always have this access to posting things because of how easy it is now with internet connectivity as a whole, right? So, good. I noticed during the presentations there that my sign for 5 minutes was not working. So you will see a paper come up. Oh, I will have to do this in order to get your attention for the 5 minutes, okay? So look out for the fingers, always works. So we have our second presentation now from Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, accounting for the dynamics of bullying on social media among secondary school students, preliminary insights from sample survey data from schools in Trinidad. Our non-presenting authors, Marjorie Jameson Charles, Renelle Lee Piggott, Safia King, and Shivana Chankar. Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard is the acting director of Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. His current academic interests include problems akin to population and development, applied statistical analysis, research methodology, evaluation research, and social policy. His current research interests focus upon children and youth, population policy and dynamics in the Kirkham Caribbean, violence prevention and safety promotion, vulnerability and resilience in small states, return migration, and the measurement of social phenomena. Since 2017, Dr. St. Bernard has been engaged as the UE lead researcher of the hemispheric project entitled The Rights of Children and Youth Partnership in Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. St. Bernard has authored several scholarly works and has been an active member of the Caribbean Studies Association since 1993. Since 2020, he has been the editor-in-chief of a new journal entitled the Journal of the Caribbean Association of Professional Statisticians. Thank you, Dr. St. Bernard, and have a good presentation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Duncan. And this presentation is really part of a wider scope of work that our team wishes to do in relation to the use of social media among children in secondary schools in Trinidad. And I say Trinidad and not Trinidad and Tobago because the COVID-19 pandemic precluded any investigation as far as this issue was concerned in Tobago. So let me pull up so in terms of the topic itself, bullying as a concept, we can see, and we have been hearing, and we know of bullying as a practice that could respond and that could result in different kinds of behavioral, physical, and emotional problems, whether they be long-term or short-term. And of course, bullying, when we think of bullying, we think in terms of unwanted aggressive behavior, often characterized by some kind of power imbalance, and it is usually behavior that is repeated over time. The end result is always harmful, whether it is for the victims who are in receipt of the bullying behavior or the perpetrators who actually carry out the bullying behavior. When we think in terms of cyberbullying, it is quite similar to the traditional bullying that takes place, generally speaking. And of course, its intent is to cause harm, and really what is deemed to be harmful from the standpoint of victims who are in receipt of the bullying behavior. I indicated before that it is repetitive, that it's largely due to power imbalances between the perpetrator and the victim. And when we think in terms of cyberbullying and bullying online, it's largely done through mobile phone devices and whether through messaging or other means. So we have a sense as to what we are talking about. And generally speaking, when we think of it, we think in terms, oftentimes we talk about this in the context of students and children in particular. There was a very good presentation earlier on with respect to the impact on children. But in this case, we are looking at secondary school students who often face bullying on social media through emails, through hateful text messages, and so on. And they do so in safe places. I mean, they are in their homes, and while at home, they get these messages that upset their lives, and perhaps in many instances change their lives forever. So this is the problem that is central to what we are looking at by way of the work we are doing. And as I mentioned before, I mentioned, of course, the main actors involved in social media bullying, the victims, the perpetrators, but there are also situations where victims can be perpetrators. And of course, we cannot leave out the witnesses and those who are privy to the bullying behavior. All of these actors are affected in different ways. So, of course, there are consequences associated with bullying on social media. And the victims of bullying on social media, they often have difficulties in terms of their activities in schools. Their scholastic performance actually suffers. There are mental disorders that go from from childhood through adolescence, youth, and then even into adulthood. And certainly there are issues that impact negatively on self-esteem. There's usually school dropout, and even suicidal ideations, so to speak. So it's a serious phenomenon that we are talking about. And I am not sure that in a Trinidad and Tobago context, we have really begun in any serious way to really understand, the demographic and social factors, and how some of these social factors and demographic antecedents and other environmental circumstances account for variation with regard to, first of all, being ever bullied, and perhaps also engaging in bullying behavior. So the purpose of this study, really, the purpose of this presentation really is to examine the socio-demographic and other related social factors that are associated with two risks: that of being a victim of social media bullying, and that of being a perpetrator of social media bullying. And this is focusing specifically on children attending secondary school. Now, these data were collected based on using the principles of survey research, targeting the population of secondary school students aged 11 to 17 in Trinidad and Tobago, Form 1 to Form 5 students in Trinidad and Tobago. That was our original intention. The schools were randomly selected, and students were selected. Students from selected schools were actually sought, subject, of course, to ethical standards that require them to have signed permission from their parents with respect to their participation. We also had, ethical approvals from the Ministry of Education. We had ethical approvals from the University of the West Indies, and our sampling frame was obtained from the Ministry of Education, and that permitted us to actually select our samples in accordance with the principles associated with probability sampling. And also, it was quite important for us to have this sampling frame, because at the end of the day, especially with COVID on the scene and the implications that COVID had for this research, we had to do our analyses based on a weighted sample, and we had to compute weights in order to do this exercise. So we collected our data. We started data collection in October 2019, and by about March 2020, after collecting data in about 14 schools, I think it was 407 students aged 11 to 17 years, COVID-19 struck and really messed up our exercise, right? We originally had about 40 schools. We were looking for at least 1,000 students. Of course, getting parental permissions, that was a difficult prospect. and that really led to an attrition in our sample size nonetheless. But COVID did strike, and once COVID hit, all we could do is get to 407 students. And that in and of itself, we started in the south of Trinidad, then moved up to Central, and we intended to do North and Tobago. Luckily, we did some schools in the North, not many schools. We did a few more in Central, and most of our schools were in South. So we had to, use a weighted sampling approach to get the numbers right. So in terms of the variables in the study, of course, being bullied on social media, being the bully on social media, those were the dependent variables, dichotomous, each one dichotomous variables. And then our independent variables really looked at gender, ethnic origin, age group, scholastic level, and scholastic level was dichotomized into upper tier, lower tier, based on entry scores that were used to determine which secondary school, those who did the secondary entrance assessment examination, the cutoff scores for specific schools. And we observed that the top tier schools, to get to the top tier schools, at least one needed to have attained a performance score of 60 or more to get into those schools. So we had the upper tier, the lower tier, and that too was determined somewhat systematically based on the statistics that were gathered. In terms of geographic region, of course, there are several geographic regions in Trinidad and Tobago as far as education is concerned. You can see them here. But because of the problems we had due to COVID, we could only talk about the northern region, the central region, and the southern region in Trinidad. We were not able to collect any schools in Tobago, although we were making headway and were about to do that when COVID struck. And then content sharing practices, we wanted to look at, to what extent, students looked at, shared and created violent content on social media and or created or shared pornography on social media. And we created a dichotomous variable there. Now, when you look at these results, you see what is happening. About 16% of the sample claimed that they had been ever bullied, and about 8.7 claimed that they were ever so that they were actually bullies. And this, of course, is really, how can I put it? This, of course, is really, okay, I see I have 5 more minutes. And this, of course, is really an underestimate, so to speak. So you come here now and you can actually see what is the distributions according to gender, age group, ethnic origin, geographic area, and so on. And clearly you can see these distributions more or less consistent with what we would expect at the population level. And when we come to these statistics now, what we actually see is that in terms of being ever bullied, what we see is that content sharing practices, scholastic level of education, and age group were statistically significant in terms of impacting and being associated with being ever bullied. In terms of being, in terms of actually being the bully, we could see that, content sharing practices, gender, educational zone, scholastic level, and ethnic origin, all of those were statistically significant variables impacting, and as being associated with being the bully. Let us see now what is happening when we look at the variables. Basically, we see the same pattern when we now do a sort of logistic regression and start looking at the odds associated with being the bully or being ever bullied. And in terms of being ever bullied, we can see content sharing practices, the school level and age group playing out there. In terms of content sharing practices, we are not surprised. Those who create and share violent content and pornography, they are much more likely to be bullied than those who never engage in that. We can see those who are in the lower tier schools, they are less likely to be bullied than those in the upper tier school. And we can see those who are 14 years old, they are more likely to be bullied. When we look at those who are bullied, of course, those who share violent content and pornography, they are much more likely to be bullies. Of course, what was surprising is, the result that this is incorrect. What is here should be male and the female should be up here. But what I think is surprising is that the males were less likely to be bullies, and that in and of itself, when compared to the females, and that in and of itself was a bit surprising. And we see, of course, a similar pattern with respect to level of schooling. And certainly when we go to ethnic origin, we find that those who were not of African or East Indian descent, they were less likely to be bullied than the other two groups and so on. Clearly, while before we would have seen some sort of association when we looked at the two-way association, when we started controlling for other variables, we saw that it doesn't matter where you are in terms of the educational districts in Trinidad and Tobago, you're just as likely to be bullied. So I think, having gone through all of that, in terms of some concluding remarks, I'd like to say that, being bullied seems equally likely despite differences in geographic location of school, despite gender, and despite ethnicity, right? That seems to come out somewhat. Bullying in upper tier schools were a little more perplexing, right? But supported by the data, right? It was supported by the data. Certainly the content sharing practices, sharing and creating violence and pornography, that stood out. And then those who were 14 years old, there's something about being 14 years old as opposed to being younger or older that made you a target to be bullied, so to speak. In terms of being the bully, what the data shows is that the bullies were more likely to hail from upper tier schools, more likely to be among females than among males, more likely to be of, well, I'm sorry, this result doesn't work well. And then, of course, more likely to share and create violence and pornography. This result here with respect to Africans was based on an earlier presentation, but based on the analyses we did, that was ruled out. In terms of the research implications, one, we need to examine interaction effects between the variables to see to what extent, we can get, some greater explanations. Two, I think the research points to target groups that ought to be central to qualitative inquiries that would help delve deeper into understanding underlying nuances that may be speculative on the basis of quantitative data. And finally, altogether, the data do support the value of content sharing practices and scholastic levels as critical factors impacting experiences of those bullied on social media and impacting the behavior of those engaging in bullying behaviors on social media. And with that, I think I am through, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. St. Bernard. And I think the research is extremely relevant within our local context, especially with these social media posts that we would have been seeing when schools open back. And that ties into the research that was previously presented, whereby the posting of things on social media, especially violence, right? For me, coming out of that, it speaks to, at this point, how do we bridge that gap from the research to policy, and then policy to implementation? Because we have an implementation gap, right? We now jump into our third presentation. Thank you so much again. exploring parental knowledge of the risk factors of sexting in secondary and high school students in St. Martin by Sharitza Peterson and Dr. Zuri Maurice Allen. Sharitza Peterson was born and raised on the beautiful island of St. Martin after pursuing her tertiary education in the Netherlands, where she obtained diplomas in social pedagogic work with specializations in disabled care and guided living. She returned to St. Martin and has served in various capacities with the field of healthcare and education. She subsequently earned a bachelor's degree in psychology from the Florida State University with a minor in child development from the Family and Child Sciences Department and a Master's of Arts degree in education in counseling and guidance from the University of the Virgin Islands. She is currently a senior year graduate student in the Masters of Arts in School Counseling program from the University of the Virgin Islands. Sharitza currently serves as a social worker at the Student Support Services Division of the Ministry of Education, Culture, Youth and Sport in St. Martin. Sharitza feels privileged to have served her community and is passionate about improving the lives of children and families. And then we have Dr. Zuri Maurice Allen, who enjoys facilitating individuals' academic, personal, and career professional development. He possesses an extensive background in higher education administration, spanning over 25 years, and currently serves as the Assistant Professor of Education and Program Director for the Master of Arts in School Counseling program at the University of the Virgin Islands. Dr. Allen is a two-time alumnus of the University of Virginia, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in English Language and Literature and a Master of Education degree in Counselor Education, respectively. He also holds a doctorate in Counseling and Counselor Education from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Dr. Allen maintains active membership in a host of professional, civic, and cultural organizations. His areas of expertise include adolescent self-efficacy and academic achievement, educational and career development of African-descended college students, and mental health and wellness among Black males in adolescence and early adulthood. Social justice and anti-racist advocacy and counseling are his most recent professional interests. Dr. Allen is a proud husband, father, and son. He's the husband of Dr. Carolyn Allen, the father of Syed Allen, and the son of Mr. Charlie and Mrs. Gloria Allen, who I am sure is very proud. All right, and we are jumping into your presentation for this afternoon. Looking forward to hear it. Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Janelle. So as mentioned, Student Support Services, I work at the Student Support Services Division at St. Martin, and Student Support Services offers a host of core services, including counseling, speech therapy, parent education, parent support, career guidance, and crisis support to the schools. And as a social worker and professional school counselor in training, I have seen firsthand devastating effects of sexting among adolescents and their families. And because of my work at SSSD, these experiences have inspired me to research parents' knowledge about the risk factor of teen sexting, which is the title of this presentation.
And good afternoon, everyone. Zuri Maurice Allen once again, and thank you, Ms. Duncan, for that very, very lovely and somewhat, I didn't realize I had written so much for my bio, but thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here today and to have one of my students to showcase her initial research that she conducted here at the University of the Virgin Islands, but on the beautiful, friendly island of St. Martin. I am the parent of an adolescent male, and I'm very concerned about what he reads, what he sees, what he encounters online and in social media. So much so that I occasionally take his iPhone and comb through it to make certain there is nothing within it or on it that should not be there. So with that said, just know that, again, I am delighted to be here to co-present with my student. She is the lead presenter. And I look forward to engaging in this topic with you and conversing with you after our presentation. So today, students, I just shared how I am the parent of an adolescent male, a high school senior in the US educational system, a 19-year-old, and how I combed through his iPhone to see that there is nothing, problematic or inappropriate within it. So today's secondary and high school students are developing in the face of a digitalized world, inclusive with its own culture and mode of conduct. Moreover, while most teens utilize social media and digital media for entertainment, educational, or social reasons, some youth, unfortunately, engage in a behavior known as sexting. So the purpose of the study conducted by my very fine, stellar graduate student, Ms. Peterson, the purpose was to ascertain whether parents understand the risk factors of youth sexting and to educate secondary and high school students in St. Martin on the consequences of sexting. Today's young people often think that, they're immortal or nothing bad can happen to them, or that their digital, footprints or imprints won't come back to haunt them later or what have you. So it's very imperative that parents know the risk factors of this phenomenon among youth, and that youth understand the ramifications and repercussions that may result as a result of sexting. So I think we all have an idea of what sexting is, and the term first came into being about, I would say, just over a decade ago in a news article within the United States. But according to, and this is a more formal definition of the term, according to Spooner and Vaughn 2016, sexting is generally defined as sending sexually explicit images, text messages, or videos via cell phones or other electronic devices. And by the way, my son also has an iPad, and I go through that as well. So there is a paucity, and I'm being generous to say the word paucity. There's a paucity of literature out there about sexting in regard to our children in the Caribbean and in Central America. But previous work in other locales, certainly justify and legitimize research specific to, the Caribbean and the Caribbean and Central America for future study. The Pew Research Center indicated in 2010, and I know this is old data, but I do have updated data for you. But back in 1910, just to show the difference, about 75% of teenagers, and this was in the United States, owned cell phones, and 1/3 sent over 3,000 text messages a month, over 3,000. What's interesting is that in 2018, and we did try to find a more recent figure for us, but in 2018, the same organization, the Pew Research Center, found that 95% of teens have access to a smartphone. Okay, so within the period of approximately 8 years, the percentage of teenagers who owned or had access to a cell phone increased from 75% to 95%. Now, again, that is specific to the United States, but I would argue that you would see dramatic increases in the number of cell phones and smartphones accessed by youth in the Caribbean and Central America as well. Also, in regard to previous work, results from a meta-analysis of 39 studies with over 110,000 participants with the age range of approximately 12 to 17 years revealed that the rate of receiving sex text messages was higher than the prevalence of sending such messages. The same researchers also found no significant sex differences in the rate of sending or receiving sex or sexual text messages. They, in addition, found youth were more likely to send and receive sex with increasing age. So that makes some sense given, you know, the developmental progression of youth and adolescence during the stage of adolescence. In Belgium, sexting primarily takes place through applications exclusive to smartphones such as Snapchat and WhatsApp. Okay, so we've gone from the text messages within the cell phone itself to applications, right? Such as Snapchat and WhatsApp, and there are multiple others. Participants in this previous work saw these applications as a more convenient, safe, and informal means of sexting communication than other mediums such as email, of course, or Facebook, regardless of the actual risk of unauthorized distribution. Moreover, sexting was indicative of smoking and substance abuse, so some of the negative ramifications of engaging in such behavior, or if not ramifications, some of the coexisting, you know, behaviors associated with sexting were found to be smoking and substance abuse. Sexting is influenced, it was determined by the study, by one study, that sexting is influenced by peer pressure and peer group dynamics. And lastly, sexting mostly occurs with the intention to flirt within the context of romantic relationships. So what may initially begin as a flirting, you know, or a means of flirting can certainly exacerbate into something much more hideous and much more dangerous. So, Ms. Peterson.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. We now move on to youth sexting and the law. So St. Maarten is an autonomous country within the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and therefore certain legal frameworks and international human rights treaties that are applicable to the Netherlands is also applicable to the island. So in the Netherlands, the abuse of sexual images had been explicitly labeled a criminal offense since January 1st, 2020. And as it relates to the St. Maarten justice system, according to the St. Maarten Youth and Morals Department, the sharing and possession of pornographic content involving youth under the age of 18 is considered child pornography under the law. And below are the specific laws that are applicable, and they are written in Dutch. However, I will translate it to English. Article 2, 195 entails providing pornography to youth, and Article 2, 196, using youth for pornography. Now, there are gaps in the literature, and while most of the studies listed above focus on the psychological, social, and legal implications of legal impact of youth sexting, there is a void in the literature as it relates to the role of parental knowledge of the risk factors of youth sexting and their involvement in guiding adolescents as a preventative intervention. And in all the studies reviewed, the interventions were focused almost exclusively on youth. The theoretical framework I used was grounded theory. And according to Cresswell 2014, grounded theory is a design from sociology in which the researcher derives a general abstract theory of a process, action, or interaction grounded in the views of the participants. This process involves multiple stages of data collection and the refinement and interrelationship of categories of information. The methodology. This descriptive study used a purposive sample of 140 parents of secondary/high school students aged 12 to 17 years who were recruited to complete a self-administered survey. A structured questionnaire was used to examine the following areas: parental knowledge of the risk factors, including the social, psychological, and legal implications of youth sexting, parents' comfort level with addressing the topic with their children, and whether parents know where to seek help to report sexting-related offenses involving minors. And this questionnaire was developed by my person. The 20-item survey consisted of a combination of dichotomous questions and Likert type rating scales, and both nominal data and ordinal data were utilized in this study. For the gender, as it relates to the gender of the participants, so the majority of the participants were female at 82.9%, followed by male fathers at 17.1% respectively. And the parental level of education, we can see that the majority of the participants had a secondary school diploma, followed by associates, bachelor's, master's, trade school diploma, primary school diploma, and doctorate degree. The children's gender and age range. So the majority of the children were female at 23.6%, followed by males at 46.4%. And the age range of the children were between, the maximum were between 12 to 14 years, followed by 15 to 17 years. This leads to the research question 1, survey results. So we are now transitioning to the results and from primary findings. So the first part of question 1, do parents understand the psychological implications of youth sexting? The results show that almost 90% of parents surveyed believe that they understand the psychological implication of teen sexting.
And these were parents
So
who, and I'm sorry, Ms. Peterson, and these were parents who stated either strongly agree or agree.
Thank you. Strongly agree, agree, neither agree or disagree, disagree, strong or strongly disagree. Similar to the first part of question 1, do parents understand the social implications of youth sexting? Almost 90% of parents surveyed believe that they are knowledgeable about the social implications of sexting. And similar, and for the third part of question 1, do parents understand the legal implication of sexting? The results indicate that over 70% of parents believe that they understand the legal implications of teen sexting. So for the second research question, do parents perceive their children are comfortable addressing sexually sensitive topics with them? We see that 61.4% of parent respondents believe their children are comfortable discussing sexually sensitive topics with them. For the third research question, the data shows that 93% of surveyed parents believe their their children are believe that they are comfortable talking to their youth about the consequences of sexting. So in this group, you can see they believe that they are quite comfortable talking to their children about these topics. For the fourth research question, the results indicated that slightly over half of parents surveyed know where to report sexting, cases of sexting-related offenses involving minors. And the findings, the results reflect that the majority of parents understand the risk factors of youth sexting. Most parents also indicated they have already spoken to their youth about the dangers of sexting. But what we saw from the other slides was, well, that slightly over half knew where to report. So there is room for improvement in terms of sharing information so parents know where to go. And the importance of this study for St. Martin. So we believe that the foundation of education begins at home. Therefore, this study focused on the nation's first educators, parents and guardians, to stimulate their role in education and protection of their youth in regard to the risk factors of sexting. And it is also our intention that the information be utilized to educate and empower parents, as well as educators and other school personnel, to effectively address this phenomenon within the home and school environment. And these are the references we use for this presentation. And once again, we would like to thank you once again for giving us this opportunity to present our research to this scientific community. And we look forward to responding to any of your questions at the end of during the discussion segment of this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have 2 points. I feel like I send over 10,000 messages a month, Dr. Zuri, so 3,000 and not so much. And the second point was, I like that you asked the parents if they thought that their children would be comfortable sharing or speaking about, sexting. But what will be interesting is if you ask the children, those parents' children, if they feel comfortable speaking to their parents, that's a nice twist. I also could appreciate the fact that this study spoke about the education of parents, and you raised it in your presentation as well, whereby majority of studies that comes out speaks about, the dangers of sexting and so on and so forth. So very informative. Thank you so much for that. Right?
Thank you.
You're most welcome.
We will now, yes, they are. You guys are making the University of Virgin Islands very proud. We now move on to the question and answer segment. And this question is for Dr. St. Bernard. Dr. St. Bernard, I guess you put on camera and spotlight. Are there any indications that access to devices and the internet differ between the regions, and any indication that this may affect cyberbullying, i.e. do people in the North upper tier schools have access to ICT, which could increase the risk of cyberbullying? That's the first question for Dr. St. Bernard.
Okay, I think, it's a very interesting question. These are thoughts that have crossed my mind as I saw the results. I have to consider this study to be more exploratory than anything else, because in a Trinidad and Tobago context, I am not convinced that, we have sufficient evidence to say, well, this is what we found with respect to how specific sets of social and demographic data are related to whether one engages in bullying or whether one has been a victim of bullying. And it is very exploratory, and in fact, the question that was posed is exactly a question I asked myself when we were actually working on this, and whether or not perhaps it could be a function of exposure to ICT devices, but it could also be a function of knowledge related to how one uses these devices, and whether or not the knowledge is perhaps the thing we should be getting at. And that opens up a can of worms, because if you remember at the end of the paper, I said that we need perhaps, some qualitative inquiries to help us understand these dynamics that are being supported by the data. And I mean, supported by the data in a very exploratory way, right? Perhaps what we need to do is to interrogate the connection a bit more. For example, I think, the person also asked, quite apart from upper tier schools, I think reference was made to district. And while when one looks at a bivariate association between district and whether or not one is a perpetrator of cyberbullying, the North stood out relative to all the other districts. The North stood out. But when we controlled for all the other variables that might be associated with cyberbullying, we found that it didn't matter which district you were in, it's the same thing. So I don't think, I will want to dwell so much on what happens across the districts. The other problem, as I said, is, our intention was to have a much larger sample and so on. This is a much smaller sample than we had anticipated. And if it is that, we are drawing on the logic of inferential statistics to make the sort of claims that I'm making that are exploratory in nature, we have to start on the assumption that there's no difference, right? And the evidence has to be sufficiently compelling in accordance with statistical principles to lead us to think otherwise. And notwithstanding the small size of the sample, we still found that, quite a few variables were statistically significant. Of course, the one about upper tier schools and so on, whereby, the lower tier schools were less likely, to house students who were bullies, number one, and who had been victims of bullying, number two. The lowest tiered school were less likely. And this leads us to wonder about, what is the motivation behind bullying, right? Which is something we did not delve in directly on the social media side of the data collection that we did. However, we used the JVQ questionnaire, the Juvenile Violence Questionnaire, which has some questions that perhaps we can interrogate to see, what that means. Is there something there that could tell us something about motivation? But then thinking about that instrument, I think it wasn't designed to go as deeply in terms of carving out, some assessment of variation in motivation. So I'm saying all of this because, not because I have done, not because my team and I have done this research, not because we have data, the data that we have could really provide us with all the answers we need to have. I am talking all of this from a very critical mindset. And I think, the person who asked the question is right in terms of, how he zoned into that particular issue, right? But it is something that is not that easy to tease out, because it's not only a function of ICT access, right? As I said before, it has to do with issues of perhaps knowledge of ICT, right? It has to do with the motivations in terms of whether there are perceptions, there are greater perceptions in upper tier schools that, that perhaps the children may have some kind of, there are some groups of children with self-esteem problems, or I mentioned power imbalance. So in terms of those who are bullies, how they define power and how they conceive of power, and what that means to them in terms of who they choose to bully in upper tier schools, to the extent that those in upper tier schools are more likely to be victims of bullying when compared to those in lower tier schools, given what the data are saying. And then, I wonder too about, in terms of the lower tiered schools, if it is that, the bullying is perhaps more likely to be physical bullying than bullying in cyberspace, right? So that's another angle that one can perhaps take. But coming back to associations with ICT, based on the preliminary data that we reviewed as a team, I don't think, there was much variation across groups in terms of access to ICT. I mean, it was very much similar. And as I said, the only time we could know if it were different is if perhaps we had a larger sample that would be large enough to perhaps permit that kind of discrimination. But given the small sample, I don't think there's been sufficient evidence to say that there is something happening in terms of the relationship that the person asked about. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. St. Bernard. And we have one more question. We have one more question here. Where is it? Oh, Dr. St. Bernard, did you examine the disability status of children in this study?
The simple answer to that is no.
Thank you, Dr. St. Bernard. And this question is to Ms. Peterson. Did the survey at any point explain the psychological, social, legal implications of sexting so parents could assess whether they knew enough about the specific risks?
Thank you. That is an excellent question. So I did not specifically provide information about the social, psychological, and legal aspects in the survey because it was exploratory in nature. So I wanted to know what they know, because I do know that within the community, there are various awareness activities that are going on. So I really definitely wanted to hear their first-hand knowledge without me giving them a prompt to see whether this is a topic that would need to be addressed within the community. So that is the reason why I didn't give that prompt.
Thank you so much, Ms. Peterson. And thank you, Leica, for your questions. That is all the questions at this point in time. Does anyone else have any questions? You can send it to the question and answer section. I'm checking the chat as well. Okay. All right, so no other questions. Dr. St. Bernard, is that okay? You'd like to close off now or give them 5 minutes?
What's the time now? It's 5:49.
Yes.
No one has any additional questions? Well, you are the chair, so you can decide.
Big responsibilities. Okay. All right, everyone. So I'd like to thank all the panelists today. Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. We do appreciate it. And I wish you best of luck in your research. And I hope to see you in big places and to hear this research turn into actually policy and then into bigger plans. All right, take care, everybody. Have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Buenas tardes, Sarah.
Yes. Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yeah.